Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Green Children of Woolpit. Sometime around 1150, in the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England, harvesters working the fields near the wolf pits that gave the village its name noticed something standing at the edge of the trench line. Two children, a boy and a girl. Their skin was green, not pale, not sickly. Green, in a way that every chronicler who later recorded the event felt compelled to emphasize. Their clothing was made from a material no one in the village recognized. Their speech was unintelligible to everyone who tried to address them. The villagers took them in. The boy, weaker than his sister, refused all food offered to him and died within days. The girl survived. She lived for years in the household of a local knight, Sir Richard de Caulnay, and slowly her skin lost its green color as she was persuaded to eat. She eventually learned English, was baptized, and according to the two independent medieval chroniclers who recorded her story, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, she explained where she had come from. She called it St. Martin's Land, a place of permanent twilight where the sun never fully rose, and everyone she had ever known had skin the same color as hers. She said she and her brother had been tending their father's sheep when they heard a great sound, like bells, and followed it into a cave. When they emerged, they were in the wolf pits of Woolpit and could not find their way back. But here is where the mystery begins. Two separate chroniclers, writing independently in different parts of England, recorded essentially the same account within a generation of the supposed event. William of Newburgh was a careful historian, skeptical of the miraculous claims that filled most medieval chronicles, and he included this story with the same measured tone he used for verified political events. Ralph of Coggeshall claimed to have heard it directly from Sir Richard de Caulnay's household. This was not a folktale embellished across centuries. This was contemporary reporting, treated by two credible medieval historians as established fact. What makes this particularly unsettling is how badly it resists explanation. The leading modern theory proposes that the children were Flemish immigrants, orphaned during the violent suppression of a Flemish settlement at Fornham St. Martin in 1173, their green skin explained by a condition called chlorosis, a form of anemia caused by severe malnutrition, and their unintelligible speech simply Flemish, a language the Suffolk villagers would not have recognized. St. Martin's Land in this reading is not a place of eternal twilight, but a garbled memory of Fornham St. Martin itself. It is a tidy explanation. It is also incomplete. The Fornham St. Martin massacre occurred in 1173. William of Newburgh's chronicle places the arrival of the children during the reign of King Stephen, which ended in 1154, nearly 2 decades earlier. If the dating in the earliest chronicle is correct, the tidy explanation collapses entirely, and no one has ever proposed a satisfying account for what those two children actually were, where they had actually come from, or why their skin was actually green. Some researchers have suggested a form of arsenic poisoning, common near certain mineral deposits, which can produce a greenish pallor. Others believe the account is simply medieval misunderstanding, compounded across two retellings, the true explanation lost to time. Still others take the chroniclers at their word, and note that no one has ever explained why two independent historians would fabricate the identical, oddly specific detail of a cave, a sound like bells, and a land of permanent twilight. We do not know who the children were. We do not know where they came from. We do not know why two of medieval England's most careful chroniclers staked their credibility on a story neither of them could fully explain. Number 9. Rungholt and the Town the Sea Erased. On the night of January 16, 1362, a storm surge tore across the North Sea coast of what is now northern Germany and swallowed an entire trading town in a single night. Chroniclers called the storm the Grote Mandrenka, the Great Drowning of Men, and estimates suggest it killed between 25,000 and 100,000 people across the region. One of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded European history. Among the settlements erased that night was Rungholt, a prosperous port town on the island of Strand, in the region then known as North Frisia. Rungholt was, by the standards of 14th century northern Europe, wealthy. It sat on major trade routes. Its harbor handled substantial shipping traffic, and local legend held that its merchants had grown arrogant with their prosperity. indulging in blasphemous excess in the years before the flood arrived. For nearly 600 years, Rungholt existed only in legend. German folklore transformed it into a cautionary tale, a lost city of sin swallowed by divine judgment, its church bells said to still ring beneath the waves on stormy nights. Historians debated whether the town had ever existed at all, or whether it was an invented morality tale grafted onto the very real catastrophe of the 1362 flood. But here is where the mystery begins. Starting in the 1920s and accelerating dramatically after 2016, archaeologists using magnetometry, sediment coring, and eventually LiDAR surveys of the Wadden Sea mudflats began mapping an extensive network of structures buried beneath the tidal sands off the coast of Schleswig-Holstein. Foundations, drainage systems, a church, a harbor, a network of settlement mounds stretching across more than 10 square kilometers of what is now open mudflat and shallow sea, exposed only during the lowest tides. Rungholt was real. The scale of what the surveys revealed was not. What makes the site particularly disturbing is what the drowned landscape shows about how completely a society can be erased in a single night. The excavated foundations reveal a sophisticated system of artificial dwelling mounds called wharften, engineered specifically to protect against storm surges, along with dikes and drainage channels representing generations of accumulated hydraulic engineering knowledge. This was not a primitive fishing village caught unprepared. This was a community that had spent decades building defenses against exactly the kind of catastrophe that ultimately destroyed it, and those defenses failed completely. In the span of a single tide, some researchers believe the true toll of the Grode Mandrenke has been dramatically underestimated, and that Rungholt is only the most thoroughly documented of dozens of North Frisian settlements erased that night. Others focus on what the site implies about medieval engineering, arguing that its flood defenses suggest an entire regional tradition of coastal hydraulic engineering that has otherwise vanished from the record, its practitioners drowned along with their work. The most recent surveys, using ground-penetrating radar between 2016 and 2023, continue to expand the known footprint of the settlement. No one yet knows how large Rungholt actually was at its height, because no one has yet mapped its full extent. We do not know how many people died in Rungholt on the night of January 16, 1362. We do not know what its final hours looked like. We know only that a community that had spent generations building itself into the mud and water of the North Sea coast was erased so completely that for 600 years, the rest of the world was not entirely certain it had existed at all. Number 8. The Voynich Manuscript and the language that resists everyone. In 1912, a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a collection of manuscripts from the Villa Mondragone, a Jesuit college near Rome. Among them was a small, unassuming volume, roughly 240 pages of vellum, covered from first page to last in an unknown script accompanied by elaborate illustrations of plants that resemble no known species, astronomical diagrams, and small human figures bathing in networks of green liquid inside organic vessels. No one, in more than a century since, has been able to read a single word of it. Radiocarbon dating conducted in 2009 by researchers at the University of Arizona placed the manuscript's vellum firmly in the early 15th century, between 1404 and 1438, ruling out the theory that it was a later hoax fabricated to deceive collectors like Voynich himself. The ink and pigments used are consistent with the materials available in that period. The manuscript is not a forgery. It is a genuine medieval document, written by someone, for some purpose, in a script that has defeated every attempt at decipherment for over 100 years. But here is where the mystery begins. The script, now called Voynichese, follows internal statistical patterns, consistent with genuine language. Words repeat with frequencies that mirror real languages. Certain letter combinations appear far more often at the beginnings of words than at the ends, exactly as in known alphabetic systems. The text has a measurable vocabulary and word length distributions that closely track known European and Asian languages of the period. This is what makes the manuscript so much harder to dismiss than ordinary medieval curiosities. A meaningless string of random symbols should not display this kind of statistical regularity. Whoever produced this text either encoded a real message using a system so effective it has survived a century of cryptographic assault by some of history's finest code breakers, including analysts who helped crack Enigma, or they constructed an extraordinarily convincing simulation of language using methods we still do not understand. What makes it particularly disturbing is the illustrations. The botanical drawings depict plants with no known real-world counterpart, roots and leaf structures that match nothing in any European or Asian herbal tradition of the period. The astronomical section includes diagrams that appear to chart stars and constellations using an unfamiliar system. The so-called balneological section shows dozens of nude female figures immersed in pools connected by elaborate plumbing, for reasons no scholar has ever convincingly explained. Some cryptographers propose the manuscript is written in a genuine but now extinct natural language, encoded using an unfamiliar alphabet. Others believe it is an elaborate constructed language, an early attempt at what linguists now call a philosophical or universal language, centuries before such projects became fashionable. Still others maintain it is a sophisticated hoax. Its statistical regularities, the product of a clever generative technique rather than genuine meaning. Confident decipherments arrive every few years, generate headlines, and collapse under scrutiny within months. A 2019 claim to have translated the text as an early Romance language was rejected by specialists almost immediately. Its methodology criticized as circular. We do not know what language, if any, the Voynich Manuscript encodes. We do not know who wrote it, or why, or for whom. We do not know what the plants are, what the bathing women represent, or what the astronomical charts were meant to track. The manuscript sits today in the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale University, fully digitized, available for anyone in the world to examine, and remains, after more than 100 years of sustained effort by professional cryptographers, completely unread. Number 7. Sutton Hoo and the King with No Body. In the summer of 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, archaeologist Basil Brown was excavating a series of earthen burial mounds on the estate of Edith Pretty in Suffolk, England, when he uncovered the ghostly impression of a ship buried in the sand. 27 meters long. Every plank of timber had rotted away over 13 centuries, but the iron rivets remained in place, preserving the exact outline of an entire Anglo-Saxon ship pressed into the soil like a fossil. At the center of the ship, where a burial chamber had once stood, excavators found one of the richest hoards of early medieval treasure ever discovered in Europe. A helmet with an iconic face mask, now among the most recognizable objects in British archaeology. A gold and garnet belt buckle of extraordinary craftsmanship, Byzantine silver bowls, Frankish gold coins, weapons, drinking horns, a lyre, and textiles woven with gold thread. By every measure available to archaeologists, this was the grave of a king. Most scholars believe it belonged to Raedwald, an early 7th century king of East Anglia, known from historical sources as one of the most powerful rulers in Anglo-Saxon England. But here is where the mystery begins. There was no body. Soil analysis conducted decades after the initial excavation confirmed that the highly acidic sand of the burial mound would have completely dissolved human bone within a matter of decades, leaving no trace. This explanation satisfied most archaeologists, but it did not entirely close the question, because subsequent chemical analysis of the burial chamber's floor detected elevated phosphate levels, consistent with the decomposition of a human body in roughly the position where a king would have been laid to rest. At the center of the ship, surrounded by his treasure, the body had been there. It had simply vanished so completely that 13 centuries later, nothing remained to identify who precisely had been buried with such staggering wealth. What makes Sutton Hoo particularly disturbing is what it implies about a period historians once called the Dark Ages, the prevailing narrative of early medieval Britain, inherited largely from surviving Roman accounts and later Christian chroniclers, described post-Roman England as a place of cultural collapse, where the sophistication of Roman civilization gave way to poverty and barbarism among the incoming Anglo-Saxon peoples. The Sutton Hoo treasure contradicts this almost completely. The craftsmanship of the gold and garnet jewelry rivals anything produced anywhere in contemporary Europe. The Byzantine silverware demonstrates trade connections stretching into the Eastern Roman Empire. The ship itself, requiring the felling of massive oak trees and the coordinated labor of skilled shipwrights, represents an engineering tradition of real sophistication. Whoever ruled East Anglia in the early 7th century commanded resources and international trade connections the old narrative of post-Roman collapse simply cannot explain. The helmet alone required the combined skill of a blacksmith, a tinner, a bronze caster, and a jeweler working in coordinated stages, implying an economy far more complex than the subsistence-level society historians once imagined for this period. Some archaeologists believe Sutton Hoo represents the burial of Raedwald specifically, based on the site's dating and East Anglia's political prominence during his reign. Others argue the identification remains unproven. Without an inscription, without a body, certainty is impossible. We do not know for certain whose grave this was. We do not know what happened to his remains, only that they were there once, and dissolved into nothing. We know only that someone, at the height of what was once dismissed as Britain's darkest and most impoverished century, was sent into the earth, surrounded by treasure that would not be equaled in an English burial for 1,000 years. Number 6. The Vinland Sagas and the continent no one was supposed to find. For centuries, 2 Icelandic sagas, the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, described a land far to the west of Greenland, discovered around the year 1000 by Norse explorers sailing under Leif Erikson. They called it Vinland, land of wine, for the wild grapes said to grow there. The sagas described encounters with indigenous peoples, the Norse called Skraelings, attempts at settlement, and eventual withdrawal after escalating conflict. For most of the last 1,000 years, this was treated as legend, colorful, entertaining, almost certainly embellished family history, passed down orally for 2 centuries, before being written down. The kind of saga material historians filed alongside stories of trolls and sea monsters. But here is where the mystery begins. In 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, following clues embedded in the saga's geographic descriptions, identified a site at Lansax Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. The excavation revealed the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement, sod-walled longhouses, built in the distinctive Icelandic and Greenlandic architectural style, an iron smithy, the only one of its kind ever found in North America outside of areas with documented European colonial contact, a bronze cloakpin of Norse manufacture, iron rivets identical to those used in Norse shipbuilding. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement firmly around the year 1000, precisely matching the saga chronology. In 2021, researchers using an entirely new technique, measuring a spike in radiocarbon levels caused by a known solar storm in the year 993, were able to date the felling of specific timbers found at the site to the exact year 1021. With scientific precision, no previous archaeological method had achieved for any site in the Americas. The sagas were not legend. They were history, recorded orally with enough fidelity that a 200-year-old story, written down centuries after the events it described, led 2 explorers directly to a genuine archaeological site 500 years before Columbus ever left Spain. What makes this particularly unsettling is the scale of what still remains unknown. Lansax Meadows was clearly a base camp, not a large permanent settlement, capable of housing perhaps 70 to 90 people. But the sagas describe Vinland itself, the land of wild grapes, as lying further south, in a milder climate than Newfoundland's, and no one has ever definitively located it. Wild grapes have never grown as far north as Newfoundland within recorded climate history, meaning the true Vinland described in the sagas likely lies somewhere along the coast of what is now the Canadian Maritimes or New England, a coastline explored for 1,000 years since and never yet confirmed by archaeology. Norse artifacts have turned up at indigenous sites across the eastern Canadian Arctic, including chainmail fragments and worked iron, found thousands of kilometers from any confirmed Norse settlement, suggesting either far more extensive Norse exploration than Lansax Meadows alone implies, or indigenous trade networks that moved Norse goods across enormous distances after brief, unrecorded contact. Some archaeologists believe additional Norse sites remain undiscovered along the North American coastline, awaiting only the right combination of saga clues and excavation luck. Others argue the Norse presence was always brief and limited, a single generation of voyages that left almost no lasting mark. Its memory preserved only by accident in the oral traditions of a small island nation. We do not know where Vinland itself was. We do not know how many voyages the Norse actually made, or how far south they traveled, or what became of the interactions the sagas describe with the peoples already living there. We know only that a story once dismissed, as folklore turned out to be a 500-year head start on the history of European contact with the Americas, hiding in plain sight inside 2 Icelandic manuscripts for nearly a millennium. Number 5. The Black Death and the Mountain That Started Everything. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population in a span of roughly 4 years. It remains the deadliest pandemic recorded in human history. For nearly 7 centuries, historians debated where precisely it began. Contemporary chroniclers pointed vaguely eastward, toward Central Asia, but no specific origin point could ever be confirmed. The trail simply vanished the further back researchers traced it, lost among fragmentary trade records and second-hand chronicle accounts, written by people who themselves were reporting rumors from thousands of kilometers away. But here is where the mystery begins. In 2022, a team of researchers, led by geneticist Maria Spyrou and historian Philip Slavin, published findings that traced the origin of the pandemic to 2 small cemeteries near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, in the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia. The cemeteries contained a cluster of unusually dated burials from 1338 and 1339, nearly a decade before the plague reached Europe, with gravestone inscriptions in the Syriac language explicitly attributing several deaths to what the inscriptions called a pestilence. Ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of individuals buried in those graves contained genetic material from Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. Genomic analysis revealed this strain sat at the exact evolutionary root of every major Black Death lineage that later swept across Eurasia, the single ancestral branch from which every subsequent European and Asian outbreak strain descended. The mystery that had defied 700 years of historical speculation was resolved not by a chronicle, not by a chance archaeological find of mass graves, but by DNA extracted from the teeth of ordinary people buried in a remote mountain cemetery. People whose community had no idea they were witnessing the opening act of the deadliest catastrophe in recorded history. What makes this particularly disturbing is what the surrounding evidence suggests about the cause. The Issyk-Kul region experienced unusually wet and favorable climate conditions in the years immediately preceding 1338, conditions known to trigger population booms among the wild marmots that serve as one of Yersinia pestis's primary natural reservoirs in Central Asia. A localized ecological shift, invisible to anyone at the time, appears to have triggered a spillover event from marmots into the local human population, which then, through the trade caravans of the Silk Road, carried the infection thousands of kilometers west into the heart of medieval Europe. The gravestones themselves record no sense of impending catastrophe. The Syriac inscriptions note the deaths and the year, and nothing more. The community left no indication they understood. They were the first documented casualties of a pandemic that would, within a decade, kill somewhere between a third and half of the population of an entire continent they likely never knew existed. Some researchers now believe similar climate-driven spillover events from marmot populations may have triggered earlier plague pandemics, including the 6th century plague of Justinian, and that the Tian Shan region functions as a recurring ignition point for pandemic disease, its ecology repeatedly pushing a lethal pathogen out of its animal reservoir and into human trade networks. Others caution that a single genetic lineage traced to one location does not fully explain the pandemic's explosive spread, and that the mechanisms connecting the Issyk-Kul outbreak to its arrival in Crimea nearly a decade later remain only partially understood. We do not know exactly how the infection traveled from a handful of graves in the Tian Shan Mountains to the trade ports of the Black Sea. We do not know how many other outbreaks like it occurred throughout history and left no trace at all. We know only that beneath two small, unremarkable cemetery mounds in Kyrgyzstan lay the answer to a question that 7 centuries of historians, working only from chronicles and speculation, were never able to solve. Number 4. The Knights Templar, and the fleet that was never found. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, agents of King Philip IV of France simultaneously arrested every Knight Templar they could locate across the kingdom. The Templars, a monastic military order founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, had by the 14th century become one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in Christian Europe, operating an early international banking network with fortified treasuries stretching from England to Jerusalem. The charges against them were extraordinary: heresy, idol worship, secret rituals. Many arrested knights, subjected to torture, confessed, later recanting when brought before less coercive tribunals. Pope Clement V, under enormous pressure from Philip, formally dissolved the order in 1312. In 1314, its final Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake, reportedly cursing both king and pope from the flames, both of whom died within the year. But here is where the mystery begins. The Templars possessed one of medieval Europe's largest fleets, based primarily out of the port of La Rochelle on the French Atlantic coast. When Philip's agents arrived to seize Templar assets across France in October 1307, the fleet at La Rochelle was gone. Contemporary records make no mention of where the ships went, who crewed them, or what cargo they carried when they departed. The Templars' vast treasury, accumulated over nearly 2 centuries of donations, banking operations, and battlefield plunder, was similarly never recovered. Philip's agents, arriving to seize what should have been one of the largest concentrations of wealth in medieval Europe, found the order's central Paris treasury largely empty. What makes this particularly disturbing is how completely both mysteries have resisted 2 centuries of dedicated historical and archaeological investigation. No wreck matching a fleet of Templar ships has ever been conclusively identified. No historical record documents their destination. The ships simply appear to have sailed away from La Rochelle sometime in the weeks before the arrests, into historical silence. Numerous theories have accumulated in the vacuum. Some historians propose the fleet and remaining treasury were relocated to Scotland, then under excommunication and outside the reach of both the French crown and the papacy. Others argue for Portugal, where the Templar order was not dissolved, but simply rebranded as the Order of Christ, absorbing Templar assets, personnel, and, by some accounts, ships into a new organization that would later fund the voyages of Henry the Navigator. Still others believe the entire fleet mystery is overstated, that the ships were simply sold or scattered among Mediterranean and Atlantic ports in the ordinary course of business before the arrests, and that no dramatic destination exists to be found, only the unremarkable dispersal of maritime assets that modern legend has since inflated into conspiracy. The most tantalizing piece of physical evidence to emerge from the affair arrived only in 2001, when researcher Barbara Frail located a document in the Vatican secret archives, mislabeled and overlooked for nearly 7 centuries, known today as the Shannon Parchment. It recorded Pope Clement V's actual private absolution of the Templar leadership in 1308, a full 6 years before Jacques de Molay's execution. Contradicting the official narrative under which the order was condemned for heresy, the papacy itself had privately concluded was unfounded. Clement, the document reveals, had absolved the Templars of heresy, even as he allowed Philip IV to destroy the order for reasons that had far more to do with the French crown's staggering debts to Templar bankers than with any genuine belief in the charges against them. We do not know where the La Rochelle fleet went. We do not know what became of the Templar treasury, or whether meaningful portions of it survived the order's destruction under a different name, in a different country, hidden inside institutions that never advertised their origins. We know only that one of medieval Europe's most powerful organizations was destroyed almost overnight for financial and political reasons its own pope privately understood were false, and that its ships and its gold vanished into a silence 7 centuries of treasure hunters, historians, and archivists have never fully broken. Number 3. The Staffordshire Hoard and the gold with no explanation. On July 5, 2009, a metal detectorist named Terry Herbert was searching a field near Hammerwich in Staffordshire, England, when his detector began registering an almost continuous stream of signals. Over the following 5 days, he and a team of archaeologists recovered more than 3,000 objects, nearly all gold and silver, from a site smaller than a modern parking space. It remains the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold ever discovered by a significant margin, roughly 5 kilograms of gold and 1.5 kilograms of silver, dated to the 7th century, the same broad period as the Sutton Hoo ship burial. But where Sutton Hoo represented the ordered contents of a single royal grave, the Staffordshire Hoard was something entirely different and far stranger. Almost every object in the hoard is a fragment of war gear. Sword pommels, hilt fittings, fragments of helmet crests, pieces of what was almost certainly a helmet as elaborate as the one found at Sutton Hoo, deliberately broken into dozens of separate pieces before burial. There is no jewelry associated with women. There are no vessels, no coins used for everyday trade, no domestic objects of any kind. The hoard consists overwhelmingly of martial equipment, much of it deliberately disassembled, folded, or bent before it was buried in the ground. But here is where the mystery begins. No one has ever determined why the objects were broken apart, why they were buried where they were, or who buried them. The site sits close to the ancient Roman road of Watling Street, near the border of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, in a period when Mercia was locked in near-constant warfare with its neighboring kingdoms. But no historical chronicle records any specific battle or event at this location that would explain a burial of this scale. Some archaeologists believe the hoard represents a collection of war trophies, stripped from defeated enemies over years or decades, deliberately dismantled to strip them of their original owner's identity before being buried, perhaps as a votive offering, perhaps simply for safekeeping by someone who never returned. The presence of fragments from multiple objects of similar type, several helmets rather than one, dozens of sword fittings rather than a handful, supports accumulation over an extended period rather than a single battlefield haul. Others propose a single catastrophic defeat, an entire Mercian warband destroyed and stripped of its war gear by a victorious enemy, who then buried the spoils rather than melting them down. The deliberate destruction of the objects, in this reading, was not about erasing ownership, but ritually decommissioning weapons associated with the dead. What makes the Staffordshire Hoard particularly unsettling is a specific object recovered among the war gear, a small strip of gold, bent and folded, inscribed in Latin with a biblical verse from the Book of Numbers, translated as "Rise up, O Lord, and may thy enemies be scattered, and those who hate thee be driven from thy face." It is a phrase associated in the period with martial victory, sometimes carried into battle, and its presence buried among broken sword hilts and shattered helmet fragments has never been satisfactorily explained. Was it carried by the victor, as a trophy stripped from a fallen enemy who had inscribed it for his own protection? Or was it buried by the defeated, a final desperate invocation folded away with the wreckage of an army that had already lost? Analysis of the hoard's goldsmithing revealed craftsmanship of extraordinary sophistication. Garnet inlay work using cutting and setting techniques that would not be matched in Britain for centuries, produced by a specialized artisan tradition that has left almost no other trace in the archaeological record. Whoever made these objects represented the absolute pinnacle of 7th century European metalworking, and we do not know their names, their workshops, or how many of them existed. We do not know who buried the Staffordshire Hoard, or why, or what battle, if any, produced it. We know only that somewhere in 7th century Mercia, an enormous quantity of the most valuable and skillfully crafted objects in Anglo-Saxon England was deliberately destroyed and buried, and that whoever did it took the reason with them into the same silence that swallowed everything else about the so-called Dark Ages. Number 2. The Cathars and the treasure that vanished from Montségur. In the early 13th century, a religious movement known as Catharism had spread across the region of Languedoc in southern France, teaching a dualist theology that rejected the authority and material wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade to eradicate the movement, beginning 2 decades of brutal warfare that killed tens of thousands. By 1244, the remaining Cathar resistance had concentrated in a single fortress, Montségur, perched atop a nearly vertical limestone peak in the Pyrenees, considered virtually impregnable. A French royal army, numbering perhaps 10,000 troops, laid siege to its garrison of a few hundred defenders for nearly 10 months. On March 16, 1244, after the fortress finally surrendered, more than 200 Cathar perfects, the movement's ascetic religious leaders, refused to renounce their faith and were burned alive in a mass pyre at the base of the mountain, at a site still known today as the Field of the Burned. But here is where the mystery begins. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, recorded decades later during Inquisition testimony, describe an extraordinary detail from the final weeks of the siege. On the night of either January 16th or March 1st, 1244, accounts vary. A small group of Cathars reportedly descended the sheer cliff face of Montségur under cover of darkness, evading the besieging army, and disappeared into the surrounding mountains, carrying something the Inquisition records describe only as the Cathar treasure. What that treasure actually consisted of has never been established. Inquisition testimony from surviving Cathars, extracted years later under interrogation, refers to it only obliquely as something of immense importance to the faith that had to be preserved at any cost, smuggled out specifically to keep it from falling into the hands of the besieging Catholic forces. What makes this particularly haunting is the sheer scale of speculation the vagueness of the sources has generated across nearly 8 centuries. Some historians propose the treasure was simply money, gold and silver accumulated by the Cathar community and its sympathizers, smuggled out to fund the movement's survival in exile, a mundane explanation for an event later generations transformed into legend. Others, taking the Inquisition's language of religious rather than material importance more literally, have proposed the treasure was a body of sacred texts, Cathar scripture and theology, considered heretical and therefore certain to be destroyed if captured, preserved instead by being carried out into hiding. The Cathar movement's own scriptures have never been recovered in any substantial quantity, their theology known to modern historians almost entirely through the hostile testimony of the Inquisition that destroyed them, which raises a genuine historical question independent of any legend. If a body of authentic Cathar religious writing did survive the fall of Montségur, where did it go, and does any of it still exist, unrecognized, in some archive or private collection today? A third and far more speculative tradition, amplified by 20th century esoteric writers, holds that the treasure was the Holy Grail itself, a legend with no credible historical foundation, but one that has nonetheless drawn treasure hunters and occultists, including a 1930s expedition sponsored by Heinrich Himmler's SS, to the region for the better part of a century, none of whom have ever produced a single piece of physical evidence to support the claim. What can be said with confidence is only this: the Inquisition itself, in its own internal records, treated the story of a smuggled treasure as established fact worth investigating, questioning surviving Cathars and their descendants about its whereabouts for years after the fall of Montségur, apparently without ever locating it. An institution with the full investigative and coercive power of the medieval Catholic Church, motivated to recover whatever had been hidden, searched for it, and failed. We do not know what the Cathars carried down that cliff face in the winter of 1244. We do not know whether it was gold, or scripture, or something else the surviving records never adequately named. We know only that, whatever it was, mattered enough for a handful of people to risk their lives descending a sheer rock face in darkness, past an army of 10,000 men, rather than let it be found, and that whatever they were protecting has never been found by anyone since. Number 1. The Silk Roads of the North and the Vikings who reached Baghdad. For most of the 20th century, the popular image of the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066, centered almost entirely on raiding. Longships appearing without warning on the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia, monasteries burned, populations terrorized by seaborne Scandinavian warriors. It was a story of violence at the edge of Christian Europe, treated for decades as more or less the complete picture. But here is where the mystery begins, and it did not begin with a single dramatic discovery. It began with coins. Beginning in the 19th century and accelerating with modern metal detecting, archaeologists across Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and Russia began recovering enormous quantities of silver dirhams. Coins minted not in Europe, but in the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic Empire centered in Baghdad. The numbers involved are almost incomprehensible. More than 85,000 Islamic dirhams have been recovered from Viking Age hoards in Sweden alone, with the single largest found on the island of Gotland, containing more than 14,000 individual coins. These were not a handful of exotic curiosities that had drifted north through some long, indirect chain of trade. The sheer density of the finds, concentrated heavily along the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, revealed something the raiding narrative had almost entirely obscured: a vast, sustained, deliberately maintained trade network connecting Scandinavia directly to the heart of the Islamic world. Operating continuously for well over 2 centuries, what makes this particularly staggering is the route the coins took to get there. Scandinavian traders and settlers, known to Byzantine and Arab sources as the Rus, pushed south along the river systems of Eastern Europe, the Volga and the Dnieper, dragging their shallow draft ships overland between river systems where necessary, establishing trading settlements at strategic points along the way, at Staraya Ladoga, at Novgorod, at Kiev. From there, the river network connected all the way to the Caspian Sea and, via established caravan routes, directly into the trading cities of the Abbasid Caliphate. Arab geographers and diplomats of the period took notice. Ibn Fadlan, an Abbasid envoy who traveled north along the Volga in 921 and 922, left behind one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of Rus traders that survives from the period, describing their appearance, their trade practices, and, in vivid detail, a ship burial ceremony for a Rus chieftain that bears a striking resemblance to the archaeological evidence found at sites like Sutton, an entire continent away. This was not incidental contact. Excavations at Staraya Ladoga and other river trading posts have recovered Islamic glass, Byzantine silk, Central Asian carnelian beads, and enormous quantities of Arab silver, alongside distinctly Scandinavian craft goods, weapons, and burial practices, revealing settlements that functioned as cosmopolitan trading hubs, stretching from the Arctic Circle to Baghdad. The scale of Islamic silver flowing north appears to have directly shaped the Scandinavian economy of the period. Hoard compositions show the flow of dirhams rising and falling in close correlation with instability in the Abbasid silver mining regions of Central Asia, meaning a crisis thousands of kilometers away. In what is now Uzbekistan or Afghanistan, measurably affected communities in Sweden and Norway within the same generation. An interconnected medieval economy operating at a scale most people have never been taught existed. What makes this the most unsettling entry on this list is not any single artifact or unexplained ritual. It is the sheer scale of the historical narrative it overturns. The story of an isolated, insular early medieval northern Europe, cut off from the wider world and defined almost entirely by its violence toward its Christian neighbors, simply does not survive contact with this evidence. The same Scandinavian populations who raided the coasts of England and Ireland were, simultaneously, operating one end of a trade network that stretched across 2 continents. Moving silver, glass, silk, and slaves along river highways, most modern maps do not even mark as historically significant. Some historians now argue the Rus trading network functioned as one of the primary arteries connecting the medieval Islamic world's silver economy to northern Europe, a role at least as significant as the more famous Mediterranean and Silk Road routes that dominate most popular accounts of medieval trade. Others caution that the extent of direct contact, as opposed to goods moving through intermediary hands, remains difficult to establish with certainty. What is not in dispute is the silver itself, tens of thousands of coins pulled from the soil of Scandinavia and the Baltic over 2 centuries of ongoing discovery, each one minted somewhere between Baghdad and the borders of India. Each one carried north along river routes by people willing to drag their ships overland between waterways rather than turn back. We do not know the names of the Rus traders who made that journey, or how many times they made it, or what stories they told when they returned home, describing the markets of a caliphate most of their neighbors would never have been able to place on a map. We know only that the isolated insular vision of early medieval Northern Europe, the story most people still carry in their heads, was never true, and that the evidence proving it wrong has been sitting in the ground in the form of Arab silver, waiting to be found in Scandinavian soil for over 1,000 years. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.